Hi, welcome. My name is Alex Bischoff, and I was invited by my dear colleague Kristen to talk about the Brazilian sports system. I'm going to make a little introduction about myself, and then we're going to proceed to the slides. I was born and lived in Brazil until 2015. I finished my bachelor's in international relations and then moved away to Germany. There, I worked and learned the language until 2018, and until I started my master's in international sports development and politics. That's actually where I met Kristen in the city of Cologne. And since my graduation, I've been working in the fitness field back in the area of Frankfurt. I will proceed to the presentation where I'm going to make it quick, try to talk a little bit about the history, the previous structures, and then proceed to the actual system and make a little overview of the life of an athlete in Brazil. Let's get started. First of all, some background history. From the middle of the 19th century until 1941, sports did not receive any interference from the state whatsoever. Things started to change back in 1937 with the creation of the Physical Education Division, but there was no reference to, for example, high performance sports. Things started to change again back in 1939 with some studies that were conducted to support the creation of some legal frameworks for sports. Because until that point, all the regulation of the sporting practices were restricted to the military schools. We have to remember that the period we're talking about was still in the middle of the Second World War. The fascists influenced a lot of governments, and that was not different with in Brazil. So, 14th of April of 1941, Decree Law number 3119. It brought the first sports regulations to the country. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the main achievements and the main issues. So, the main achievements. Created the first National Sports Council, CND, responsible for the regulation of all sports in their respective federations and confederations. Also, the government recognized some new duties as for guiding, supervising, and encouraging the practice of sports throughout the whole country. And references are made finally to professionalism and amateurism. But this all came with also many issues, and I'm going to list them right now because this law did not mention high performance sports, school sports, or participative sports. It was very much into controlling it. So it also prohibited the use of capital for objective of making profits. So only for sustaining the associations and leagues. No profits were made like we have, for example, nowadays. And last but not least, I think for me the worst one, the Minister of Education and President could transform, reverse results, and legislate according to particular conveniences in favor of clubs or entities. This is an absurd, but this also reflects the whole authoritarianism of governments that was happening during that time. All right, I wanted to bring you guys some also curiosities about this law, and actually it's a very sad fact because women were denied sport practices. In the article number 54, it said, women shall not be allowed to practice sports incompatible with the conditions of their nature. Actually, it meant basically that the practice of fighting of any nature, soccer, water polo, rugby, weightlifting, baseball, were not allowed for women. Because there was this idea that women should play specific roles, such as working and taking care of their children. So the government thought it was a good idea to actually regulate which sports were suitable for which gender. And it was sadly until 1979, so basically for 42 years, there was this prohibition. Basically could explain a little bit why also took so long to actually Brazil start to develop women's sports. All right, here we have the structure of sports created by this law. Even though it's in Portuguese, the elements are not hard to understand, so I'm going to follow here in English so we can analyze it together. It's a top to bottom, it's pretty simple. On the top we have the state, and at federal level we have the Ministry of Education and Health. Under we have the newly built National Council of Sports, and under we have the confederations. at state level, we have the federation and the capital associations. And at city level, we have the leagues and the local associations. It's pretty interesting to know that on the right side, we have mentioned some organizations that did not have enough representation to enter in the actual system, but at least, as I said, they were recognized, as for example, the sports in the university and sports in the army. Right, in the period between 1941 and 1993, we cannot see any major changes in the sports system. What we can see is there was a period marked by the regulation and management of the so-called basic principles of sports organization. We have to remember that during this time, the state was still controlling very strongly sports in the country, and it was actually trying to keep the whole financial situation and organizational situation under their control. So the development of associations, non-profit purpose, no remuneration of the managers, internal and external control of the administrative practices, and accounting transparency were the focus of any changes that happened in between this period. The latter being very interesting because although they were actually asking for accounting transparency, there was a very huge omission from the state into actually organizing sports, which led to a lot of bribery happening in this time, which is a very ironic situation where you have the state controlling it, asking to regulate it, and making less work happen, so the bribery actually runs freely. It all led to one very sad fact, that confederations, federations, leagues, clubs could not function exclusively according to their management's will. They were locked and they were actually depending on the government to evolve. After this huge gap we just talked about, we arrive in 1993. It's the first big leap in the Brazilian sports system, and it's a very important landmark in our history. This gentleman, as you can see, it's called a Zico. The law number 8672 was named after him. He's still alive, but he was a very notorious football player. Sad story, he actually played in 3 different World Cups and didn't win a single one. But yeah, he was very good and enough to have a law that brought so many good changes named after his person. Well, this law is very important because it created the first law dispositives for sports, making the state responsible for the right of all people to have access to sporting practices, and also established the formal recognition of different sports manifestations as educational sports, participation sports, and performance sports. The law Zico was very important for the development of the sports system in Brazil, because mainly of this law dispositives that I mentioned before, because it brings now a new responsibility to the government, no longer as a controlling agency, but now one that will foster and promote sports for the population. It states basically that the government will no longer intervene as a national guardian of sports. Also, it regulates the labor of professional soccer athletes and the relationship in between them and the clubs. It marks also the decentralization because it gives now the sports industry more autonomy. And there's a change from the National Council of Sports now by the Superior National Council, which now is going to have a consulting and regulatory function only, not anymore as execution function and acting agency. Also presented the concern of the state to admit other dimensions of sports, as improving the physical fitness of the population, increasing the level of sports in all areas, implementation and intensification of sports for the population, elevation of the performance of the national athletes, and dissemination of sports as form of leisure time. Here we have the new structure created by the Law Zico in Brazil. It's again in Portuguese, but let's try to analyze like the other ones. So this new system is called the Brazilian System of Sports, and on the top we have the state, but directly under it and controlled by it only the Ministry of Education and the Sports Office, which are responsible at a state level and city level for the educational and university sports. The same level as the Ministry of Education, we have the National Council of Sports, the Olympic Committee, the Administration of Associations Office, responsible for civil associations and private ones, and we have the League Office, which is responsible for the regional leagues and state leagues. So basically, this is characterized by the new decentralization and giving each office and each subject and specific administration. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, now I present you guys a second big leap in the Brazilian sports system history. Here in front of you is Edson Arantes do Nascimento, or better known as Pelé. He's considered the king of soccer. Of course, we have like players now breaking a lot of records, but he is still the one that had it all. Mostly because he participated and won in 3 World Cups in 58, 62, and 70. So no wonder why we named this very important milestone after him. Well, it's important for us to understand now that even though the Zico law had an historical importance in terms of adapting the rules to a new conjuncture, it was Pelé law that proposed to replace it and give continuity to the process of sports regulation according to the Federal Constitution from 1988. Right, so why was the Pelé law so important? Actually, because it didn't come to change the whole system or the structure. It came to give a better regulation from the development that the Zico law started. So they actually shared the same concerns, and they were actually the strengthening of the federations, leagues, and other private entities, separating the attributions of the public power from those of the private one, and granting more mobility to the private organizations. Well, the creation of the Ministry of Sports. Actually, this is very interesting because now the Education Ministry would provide assistance. So from now on, the education is separated from sports, which got its new representation in the system for itself. Also, the creation of the executing agency called INDESP. This actually means that from now on, this new agency, the state, is bringing for itself also one executing agency, not only anymore as only regulating from the top to bottom, but also acting according and trying to foster it as per se elaborating the national sports plan and acting to represent the will of the state into the sports policies. And it is very interesting also, one characteristic of this law, that although it does not create any fiscal incentive to sports, it establishes the conditions for the receipt of these incentives. And not only that, but from other federal public resources. Alright, the main focus of the Pelé law. So we talked previously about the different manifestations of sports recognized by the state from the Zico law on. Here in the Pelé law, they're going to be developed, and the government's going to come out with guidelines of how and why they should be promoted. So we're going to start with the educational sports. Here we see the development of the value of sports in an individual level, where avoiding hyper-competitiveness, the government sees the purpose of achieving the integral development of the individual and its formation for the citizenship, exercise, and leisure practice. Well, in the second level, we see the participation sports, not anymore in an individual level, but now the state sees the purpose of contributing for the integration of the practitioners in the fullness of the social life. So not only for the person itself, but the surroundings, the people around, and also the value of the health value of sports in one's life. And third but not least, we have the performance sports, where the state sees that the purpose is obtaining results and integrating people and communities of the country. So so it sees now that the performance sports has a country value, and it goes above the others two, that together would bring the whole debate about the social cohesion and the Olympics and World Cup benefits, which we can also start another debate, but that's not the focus for today. Another last thing about the performance sports, also here it's recognized the necessity of organizing the professional and no professional performance sports. Alright, here we are again with another structure of the Brazilian sports system, this time the one created by the Pelé Law. It's again in Portuguese, but let's try to analyze it together again. So, even though the Pelé Law was enacted in 1998, its final version came only in 2013 with the Decree Law number 7984 that had the purpose of instituting some general rules for sports in Brazil. It basically stated that the government would be responsible for something you already know, for promoting and foment sports. But this time, the national sports system would manage sports organizations. And that changes a little bit the structure, so let's try to go with it. On the top we have the Brazilian system of sports, the name of the whole structure. Then we have the state, and we have the national system of sports. Both of them at a state level, not federal anymore. And then under the government, we have the Ministry of Sports and the National Council of Sports, the one we talked about that was responsible to create the guidelines. And then under the National System of Sports, then we have the management of the organizations, such as, for example, the Brazilian Olympic Committee or the Paralympic Committee, the Brazilian Clubs Federations, and the offices of associations, which are then responsible for sports in a state level and also city level. And also we have then the league coordinations in the city level and also in state level, making a slightly difference from the Zico law, because now it separates completely the government duties, and it creates a system in itself just to run the organizations, while the state focus on creating the guidelines and creating law dispositives to implement sports as a whole in the country. Right, here again with another year gap from 2000 to 2019. It's almost a 20-year gap, and the reason for that is because during that time there was only one party in power, called the Workers' Party, the PT, from the former President Lula and the subsequently former President Dilma. Well, we know already that this structure was already fixed in 2013 with the final version of the Pelé Law. But what we don't know is that Brazil would receive a lot of international influences in sport during those terms. Well, what's important to understand is that there were no major changes after the Pelé Law, but there was a lot of development in terms of national policies. Why? Because we had the national conferences on sports happening in 2004, 2006, and 2010. With the objective to discuss and elaborate actions related to the implementation of public policies for the sector. Those conferences were very important because that's when the government took its time to decide and think about how to promote and foment sports as it wanted. And we had also the major international competitions that happened in Brazil in 2007 with the Pan American Games, the World Cup in 2014, and the Olympics in 2016, which leaves us into the actual system. Alright, we finally arrived in the present days. I call this the third leap, which are the changes promoted by controversial President Bolsonaro that is actually going to run for president this year against the controversial former President Lula from the Workers' Party, the one we just talked about. It's going to be a very interesting election. I really have no idea what's going to happen, but for sure it's going to be very entertaining. So whoever is interested, keep your eyes on it. Well, as controversial as Bolsonaro is as a president, so were his changes in the sports system. And we're going to go to the chart to try to analyze it better and visualize it better. But as an introduction, actually, Bolsonaro created the Ministry of Citizenship, composed by the Social Development Bureau, and renamed the Ministry of Sports into the Special Sports Bureau. Well, the Sports Bureau function was basically to advise the Ministry of Citizenship in the supervision and coordination of the national sports policy, and to ensure the development of policies and incentives for high-performance sports. So let's take a look into the chart and see how the system is looking nowadays. So this is how the system is looking nowadays. It looks much more intuitive. There are some new organizations created and also has some divisions that probably separate and give more autonomy to the work in the specific areas of the sports system in Brazil. Let's take a look how it's working in practice. On the top, we have the Special Sports Bureau, which is the former Ministry of Sports. Under it, we have the Department of Pelé Certification. We have the project board of directors and the infrastructure department. They are not directly connected to the next agencies, but they also are the ones that create the guidelines. So we have the organization which is responsible for the incentive and fomentation to sport, and actually is responsible for the creation of financial policies for sport. After that, we have the department that creates guidelines and policies for the development of sports, education, leisure, and social inclusion. Then we have the high performance sports department, which is responsible for all the Olympic duties that we had one before. Straight away, the Olympic Committee, so they're all under this specific organization, and also a very interesting program from the government called Bolsa Atleta, which is actually a scholarship for the athletes and also helps them to receive some money. But we're going to see if that's enough later. Then we have another very interesting agency directly made for football, which actually deals with the rights of the fans and the governance of football. After that, we have the doping organization related to all the doping duties and requests for sports. And last but not least, the power sport department, responsible for the Paralympics and all of that other requests from those athletes. So basically, this is how the system is working nowadays. The actual scenario. I brought here some facts extracted from the government's website and from some newspapers that tells us a little bit about the impact caused by the structural changes promoted by Bolsonaro on sports. And the first thing I want to introduce you is that the impact on the Olympic sports was actually positive, because during the Tokyo Olympics, Brazil won 21 medals, 2 more in comparison to 2016. There were 7 gold, 6 silver, and 8 bronze. So you see 2 more bronze medals for the country. And Brazil also finished in the 12th place in comparison to the 13th place in 2016. Also, there were a lot of investments in the year of 2021, where the government invested $372 million in sports, amounting 2 billion reais, Brazil's currency. 1,083 new sports infrastructures were built, and 2,500 new projects were in development. Of course, we cannot say that that was the reason alone why Brazil was better actually in the Olympics, but there's probably some contribution that the structural changes brought so Brazil could do better during the Olympics. Soccer and the Olympic modalities. As we know, Brazil is considered the country of soccer, and of course it is interesting to understand how soccer comes into place when we talk about sports in general. Of course, there is a huge discrepancy in between the private initiative that's where soccer is allocated and Olympic modalities that mostly depend on sponsorships and the government. But still, let's take a look at why and how much money is actually running into soccer in comparison to the Olympic modalities. Soccer. Let's talk about only the 16 elite clubs in Brazil. They alone won almost $977 million in 2020. This is actually 6.2 billion reais, Brazil's currency, which is almost 3 times more than what the government alone invested in the Olympic modalities, as we talked before. we have that even though the government invested almost 373 million in sports in 2021, the Olympic Committee will directly share only 43 million across 34 modalities, which actually have the top shares being judo with 1,400,000, volleyball also the same, gymnastics 1,350,000, and the lowest share with climbing with $500,000. As we can see, it's a huge difference because we have also 34 modalities, while we have some clubs that earn a huge chunk of this $977 million only themselves. So here we see how actually athletes that are not playing soccer are living in comparison to football players. How is to be an athlete in Brazil? We just saw the discrepancy between being a soccer player and being an Olympic player. But in the reality, how is the difference? How much one and the other earn? So I brought here two different athletes from Brazil that will actually introduce us to a bit of this huge difference that there is. The first one is this gentleman here, probably everybody knows him, Neymar Jr. He was a former Santos Football Club player in Brazil and is currently playing for PSG. Well, he's now making $42 million a year, but in 2012 he was already making 11 million, which tells us how much money soccer player of high performance, high level could earn already in Brazil. While we have this another gentleman here called Darwin Romani. He's a shot put athlete and he won 4th place in 2020 Olympics. The history of this gentleman here is that during COVID, all the facilities were closed, so he had nowhere to train. He ended up training in a construction site close to his home, and he then had a herniated disc due to the poor training conditions and recovered just before the Olympics and still managed to win the 4th place. And how much this national hero earns? Well, an Olympic or Paralympic athlete from 14 years old on will earn a monthly estimated of $586. We can see that's what they probably could earn from the government, maybe some sponsorships, but definitely we're not talking about 11 million. So this shows a little bit what some Olympic athletes and modalities have to go through to achieve and win a medal sometimes, while other modalities and while the private initiative pays the amount that sometimes the whole organization will make. And to close it up, the conclusion. Even though Brazil already achieved better position in the last Olympics and we see some progression, I still have some criticism about the direction of the sport policies in the country. And to conclude, I would like to leave this sentence here. The Brazilian sports system has developed over the years in the papers, but the inefficiency of money distribution and devaluation of athletes still prevents the country to achieve higher levels in elite sports and, most important, to provide a decent income to athletes. The latter one actually relating to the fact that still nowadays athletes, if they are not world-class athletes, they might have to have a second job, they might have to train, as we saw in construction sites, and this is a situation that prevents a lot of people even to think about becoming an athlete full-time, which prevents the country to find and foster talents. So I think we saw enough of a structure to understand that, yeah, there is a lot of studies behind it and a lot of will from the government to make a better system, but there's a lot of problems in the middle that still prevent substantial development. So thanks for staying until the end. I hope you could learn a little bit of the Brazilian sports system, and I'm available for any further questions. Thank you.